Good morning. Nice to see a few souls, brave or foolish, ventured out when it's 30 below wind chill, but it's good to see you. My talk today is about unnecessary suffering, and really looking at it from how we deal with the political stuff that we run into every day. Find myself thinking about it quite often, but this is an election year, so we're going to be bombarded with all kinds of political things. And my thoughts are really around how to live with the intention of not causing unnecessary suffering for anyone, ourselves or anyone else for that matter. Hopefully it will be consistent with the teachings of the middle way, but I'm going to throw in some Western psychology things as well. Over the years, I've had a number of friends and acquaintances who have told me that they are apolitical, and they say that based on, these are friends who follow various Buddhist traditions based on lines from Buddhist teachings or sutras. Most often, or at least the one that I remember the most, is the opening line to the sutra titled Trusting the Heart Mind. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. I've also read a few, I think I'd call them opinion pieces in various Buddhist newsletters that espouse that same approach, that somehow based on Buddhist teachings that someone should take an apolitical posture. I did have actually some pretty meaningful conversations with people who had that opinion, and I will tell you, I suppressed my initial impulse, which was to say, saying that you're apolitical based on any reason, whether it's your Buddhist practice or any religion, is a pretty powerful political statement, right? But I knew if I said that, it would probably change the tone of those conversations. But what I did actually observe is that people who were saying that, at least the people I talked to, had a real narrow definition of what is political. They were talking about electoral politics, Republicans, Democrats, all the negative things that go back and forth, all the things that we're going to hear even more of during this year. But for the purpose of this talk, and this is what I believe, the definition of what is political is a lot broader than that. It includes a lot of things. I would say homelessness is a political issue. Poverty, significant discrepancy in our society and around the world between those who have excessive amounts of things and those who have nothing. Discrimination towards people who are of a different race, have a different religion, maybe because of their national origin, their gender preference, gender identity. Those are all political issues. Voting rights. A hot issue in this past year has been, hot political issue has been legislation to inhibit a woman's right to reproductive health care. I mean, these are all significant political issues that we've heard a lot about, and we're going to continue to hear about that because we're in a political system that encourages us to align with someone and against someone else. So that's really what my talk is going to be about. But let me comment just a little bit about that line from Trusting the Heart Mind. First of all, I'll say I'm always very cautious and a little skeptical when someone cherry picks the line out of any religious approach or any philosophy or Buddhism and say that line means that someone should behave in a certain way. My understanding, whether it's correct or not, of the teachings of the middle way is that as a body, those teachings point the way. They don't tell anyone what to do. They point the way, and then we get to decide what we want to do. Not that we're on our own necessarily. Even if you practice at a meditation center like Dharma Field, there are Dharma teachers here who can help you if you need that help. But for me, it's a mistake to think that one line in any of the teachings tells us exactly what we should do. But putting that aside, I will make a little interpretation of that line from that sutra just for the purposes of my talk. And I'm not saying that I know what it means. And I think most of us are pretty familiar with that sutra, at least somewhat familiar with it. And you know that opening line, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences, just sets the tone for that really profound teaching. But again, for the purposes of this talk, I will say that it kind of raises the question, who are those people who have no preferences? Those people who find no difficulty in following the way. Maybe that's the people who are awake to their true nature, right? Who are not inhibited by illusions of permanence or self. For them, it may not be difficult, but what about me, or what about the rest of us who do not live our lives always aware of our true nature? We're the ones who struggle with ideas and desire for things to be permanent. We struggle with the idea that we somehow are separate in sustaining self, and all the things that go along with the idea of being a separate self, all the things that we're familiar with, right? Self-righteousness, indulgence, judgmental self, angry self. There's a whole list of things, and we know that those things can cause difficulties for us, and we know that when we're in a state of agitation, which might occur in the context of some political discussions, that those illusions of a separate self are likely to pop up and cause some difficulties. One of the things we do know is that when the conditions of our life are calm, that those illusions of permanence and self are relatively calm. But when the conditions of our life are agitated, those illusions become much more agitated, much more present. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, really from several perspectives. One of them is how we handle emotions. One is how we handle our thinking, our communication, and finally, our karma. All from the perspective of trying to live with the intention of not causing any unnecessary suffering in those circumstances. Let me start with talking about handling our emotions. All of those political issues that I mentioned and others can cause a pretty strong emotional response. We might get anxious. We might find ourselves worrying about ourselves, worrying about our children, our grandchildren, worried about the future of our country. Sometimes we might feel depressed or have a little despair. Sometimes we might feel agitated or angry. And sometimes we also might have a sense of hope. Let me talk about that just briefly, and then I'll get back to those things that we think of as more negative emotions. And this is based on some conversations I've had with people who feel really kind of hopeless about what's happening in our country and what will happen around the world. So I talk with them about hope based on the paradigm of change. Some of you may know I made my living for 40 years doing psychotherapy. And so understanding change is a very important part of trying to do that work. And that paradigm of change is the same for society as it is for individuals. You may have noticed that when you were thinking about making a change, even one that you decided was good for you, that you had a lot of resistance to that, right? You think, oh, I think I want to start exercising some more. I want to start changing my diet, and great idea. But there's something that was inhibiting you from doing it, right? There was resistance. And that's a normal process, right? We understand that. If you ever work someplace where the management changed the policies towards employees, everyone got in an uproar, right? Oh, this change is going to be horrible. There was massive resistance, regardless of whether the change was going to be good or not. We've all probably had that experience. I remember, actually, Steve, when we changed the morning time for meditation. Some of us, I won't mention anyone, I was one of them, we were pretty resistant to that. We started, those who don't, we started a half hour later, I think, I remember correctly, from 5:30 to 6, which sounds like a good thing, actually, in my life now, but then it wasn't. So there was resistance. But then when you think about change in society, lots of examples. I'll choose race relations in this country. Other than you, most of us were alive during the 60s when there was all kinds of civil rights movements. You'll probably, maybe you know about it, or maybe you'll read about it at some point. And we know that there was a significant movement towards civil rights, and there was a very significant resistance, right? There was a violent resistance to that change. But that change actually occurred. Things got better. And racism didn't disappear, right? But things improved. And we've seen that same cycle since then. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example. Very strong resistance to that. And we see the same thing in other parts of our society. Acceptance of people based on immigration status or gender preference, all of those kind of things. There's been a lot of resistance to those kinds of things, but ultimately there has to be some hope that the changes will take place. Historically, they've taken place. Things have changed, and although I have a somewhat pessimistic view of where our country is right at this point in time, I also have hope that changes will take place, that the things we see the most resistance to are the things that will actually change. So that was supposed to be a talk about positive emotions. It didn't sound that way when I was saying it, but the negative emotions, the things you might think of as anxiety, depression, agitation, they're just part of our normal repertoire of emotions. Every human has the same range of emotions, right? It's the way that we mediate our life in the relative world. It's how we think about things. We have to have that. We can't have a new emotional response to every event. We would just sit around doing nothing if that was the case. So it has great value. A lot of our responses are habitual, right? We have the same response to the same stimuli. Some of those are very helpful, some are not so helpful. It's really not psychology, it's really the neurochemical component to that, which I think can be helpful to think about at least briefly. Every time we have an emotional response to a particular stimulation, and if it's the same response, or any response, it follows a neurochemical pathway in our brain, right? If we have the same responses, the same stimuli, it follows that same neural pathway and it reinforces it. And the more often we do that, the more easy it is for us to have that same emotional response. It becomes a habit, the path of least resistance. And some of those are actually quite helpful. We have to have some of those not so helpful. We might think along that same topic of brain chemistry around meditation. For those people who have a regular meditation practice, meaning over time and with regularity, they probably noticed that how they approach a meditation has changed, right? That they don't think about it as much. They come into if they're meditating in this room, they come into the Zendo and they sit on the cushion, and that meditative mindset is much easier to occur. If you have just a sporadic practice, or you only meditate when it's convenient or when you feel like it, you probably won't have that experience. It's a regularity of practice that really changes that brain function. There's a lot of research on that, actually, and it's very interesting about brain chemistry, brain changes. Anyone who has a persistent meditative practice, whether it's the meditation we do here, or it's yoga meditation, or transcendental meditation, when people look at brain changes, there is a change in brain function, neurochemical function, that comes from that. It's the same change that comes from us habitually having the same emotional response. So then the question is, how do we change that response? One of the things that we're taught in this practice is awareness, right? To live in awareness. That would include awareness of our emotional state, our emotional responses. There may be some time, if the the conditions are right, when we might decide to sit with some of our, what we call negative emotions, so we have a little better understanding of that. We might be more comfortable with it. Excuse me. We might take the opportunity to look at our emotional response. Excuse me. Anyway, so we might look at those emotional responses from the perspective of our illusions of permanence and self. How much of it has to do with our ideas about self and others, our ideas about being indignant or self-righteous, and things that are less difficult than that. But it may be helpful just to take that time when you find yourself suffering unnecessarily from any emotion, to look at it from the perspective of what is it about me and about my attitude towards life that is making this worse. It's probably particularly helpful around political issues because we can get pretty agitated and we can say and do things that are not in the best interest of anyone, including ourselves. But you really can only do this when the conditions are right, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of intention. But it may have some benefit, it may be of merit. So we got this organized in a certain way. The next thing is, I'm going to offer some comments on thinking, particularly thinking about politics, but other things as well, in a way that is designed to not cause unnecessary suffering for ourselves or someone else. Now, I do get the impression in some Buddhist circles, not here actually, but in other places, that thinking has kind of a bad reputation, that it's not, that part of the practice is to not gather information and not to increase your knowledge. And I've never really understood that. Maybe I misunderstand what they're saying, but it sounded at times as if people were misinterpreting the practice of cultivating a mind of not knowing, as if that meant a mind that didn't know anything. And I only mention it because I sometimes find some confusion in that, but I do think, again, my interpretation, the mind of not knowing is the mind that is open to direct experience. It's just a mind that's open to everything, not a mind that filters your experience through all of our ideas, all of our biases, and all of our thinking. Actually, critical thinking, which just definitionally, critical thinking is just gathering information from reliable sources, analyzing it, conceptualizing it, and then applying it to your life, right? It's gathering all the information in a reasonable way. That is essential when taking up this practice. We have to use that kind of thinking if we're going to be meaningfully engaged. But our thinking naturally has a lot of characteristics, of which many of them are very helpful and needed. We have a lot of biases, prejudices, preconceived notions, probably opinions, expectations, those kinds of things. And we need to have them because otherwise everything would be a new experience. You know, we'd have to figure out how we're going to get up from the cushion rather than it just be something we already know. So it's very natural, but it also can be problematic, right? Some of our ways of thinking are steeped in wholesome thought, some in less wholesome thought. And we carry those biases in the most parts of our lives, probably every part of our life. Actually, when we took up this practice, we brought those ways of thinking into the practice, right? We had ideas about what it was going to be like. We had biases about it. We had expectations, had opinions. Maybe at some point we noticed that that way of thinking was not all that helpful. That way of thinking just caused us to try to filter the teachings through our mindset, actually to have the teachings conform to our way of thinking. At some point, you may have given that up and maybe things have gone a little bit better. Essentially, we might have began to approach the teachings with an open mind, although I hate to use that term open mind because it's usually a term that implies some criticism, right? As in people telling me, you need to have an open mind about something. So I like to not bring that up so much, but I do remember Frank Zappa, who many of us know who Frank Zappa is, creative genius, unusual character. He would oftentimes get very negative feedback from music critics. They didn't like his style of creativity. And I just read this about him. I didn't know him, obviously, but apparently he would always say to those critics or to someone asking him about those critics, a mind is like a parachute. It doesn't work unless it's open. That was not original to him, but that was his only response. He wouldn't get into any of defending his creativity or criticizing the critics, et cetera. But anyway, I like to avoid using that term open mind just because of the frequency that I've been reminded to have an open mind. Never happened with you? No. Yeah. All of those biases that we have in our thinking flow into our view of political issues. And I'm really talking more about how we handle our response to other people, not to the issue itself. Here's an example. We're out somewhere and we see someone wearing one of those red hats that say MAGA on it. We have an emotional response probably, but we also have, some thoughts about it. Some of us might think it's a kindred spirit, Others might think, it's a poor fashion statement. And then others may have something less kind than that. But think about it, about that person. The truth is we don't know anything about that person except they're wearing a red hat. We have ideas about it, but we don't know for a fact, right? And so if perchance we have an encounter with this person, a conversation, if we come into that conversation with all of those biases, there's a chance we might create some difficulties. We might cause some suffering for that person or ourselves. Again, it's trying to be aware of those biases and to not attach too strongly to them. I'm going to actually talk about two other concepts about thinking. And these are from Western and contemporary psychology. One of them is a concept that's called intellectual humility. It's a nice term, right? Those of you, well, I say contemporary, but I mean in my lifetime. Those of you who were involved in any kind of research back in the 70s, 80s, maybe in the 60s, a little before my time, you might have run across that term, or intellectual humility. That was instruction to the researcher. Instruction that if you're going to do research, whether it's truly scientific research or it's maybe the less rigorous research of social research, social psychology research, you have to have humility. You can't bring your biases, your expectations of outcome, any of those things into the research, because that will contaminate it. The findings will be tainted. They'll have what's called researcher bias. And the only way to have that, not be biased, is to have that humility, to understanding that you don't know. You don't know the outcome. That's not easy to do, right? If you were involved in any kind of research, if you were in graduate school, there was a lot of peer review, and there was also your research was held up to the standard that if someone did the same research, it had to have the same outcome. Otherwise, it was not valid. Now, when I first heard that term, I don't think they use it anymore because it doesn't sound so socially acceptable. I was in graduate school, and I thought it was really referencing the fact that most graduate students think they're pretty damn smart, and they needed to come down a notch, right? You need to have some humility about things. Intellectual humility is probably very helpful in how we view other people and eliminating some of our biases and some of our ideas. The second construct I'm going to talk about is something actually that Steve Hagen mentioned a few weeks ago in your talk, and that is it was actually very substantially researched phenomenon called the Dunning-Krueger effect, and you talked about it some. I'm going to expand on that a little. This was a social psychology research done on cognitive bias. Very helpful. Initially, what it established was that those people who know the least about a subject are very likely to overvalue what they know and also to devalue what other people know, especially what the experts know. And we see that in our society. We think things like, vaccinations, infectious disease control, the pandemic. There was a lot of that, a lot of it going on. As they expanded that study, they noticed on the other end, among the experts, people who really know, that they had a very disdainful, not all of them, but some had a very disdainful attitude about those people who knew less. Now, the unfortunate part from the study is that neither end of the spectrum had any productive insight. Neither one of those groups understood that their attitude had negative repercussions. And we see that again in a lot of discussions with extremes become more extreme. There's other reasons for that, but when we think about discussions around things like infectious disease control, you've got the experts on one end. Some of them are fairly vocal about they think of as the non-experts on the other end. And we see people who know little about infectious disease control espousing all kinds of things of which they know nothing about. Now, the good news is those are small percentages of people. Most of us fall in the middle, right? We know, if we use the example of infectious disease control, we know something about it. We make efforts to educate ourselves, but we respect the experts. We understand that they know about it. We are not experts in public health. Most of us are not, or in medical treatment of infectious disease, so we rely on that. And while we may have some less than kind thoughts about those people who are espousing misinformation on the other end, we probably have some pity for them, right? We probably feel bad for them that they're stuck in that role. The only thing we have to pay attention to is to make sure we don't stray to either side of that spectrum. We want to stay in the middle, where most of us are, and most of us will continue to be. The two other elements to that study, one is that education is a significant variable. And education is an intentional behavior, right? People choose to learn stuff or choose not to learn stuff. Intelligence is not. IQ, as we measure it, is not. And those of us who made a living in clinical psychology or neuropsychology or school psychology or are teachers, worked as an educator, you know that intelligence is a given and it flows over a certain spectrum, right? There are one end of the spectrum, there are various degrees of cognitive or intellectual efficiency. On the other end, there are various degrees of intellectual superiority. Again, most people fall in the middle, right? We're in that, low average to high average range, and we're comfortable with that. For the most part, we've accepted that. I mean, there may be times when we wish we were a little brighter. Probably not so many times we wish we were a little duller, but we're comfortable with where we're at. And again, we don't have to be experts on intelligence. You don't have to be a clinical psychologist or a neuropsychologist or a teacher. We just have to be sensitive to the difficulties that exist on both ends of that spectrum, right? People who have cognitive deficits, or not cognitive, intellectual deficits, have certain difficulties. We have to be sensitive to that. Those are more obvious to us. People who are on the extreme end of intellectual superiority have a lot of difficulties. We're not as thoughtful about that, but we need to make sure that we're sensitive to that when we're talking with other people. The other thing we don't want to do, and probably you all understand this quite well, you never want to tell someone that you're smarter than they are. That never goes well. I mean, that will cause a lot of suffering, probably more for you than for someone else. Let me talk a little bit about communication. Communication with the intention of not causing unnecessary suffering. There's really three parts to communication. One, which is nonverbal. I'm not going to talk about that at all. But the other two components, of course, are listening and speaking. And of those two, listening is by far the more difficult of the two. Listening with an intention of not causing difficulties for someone or causing suffering. Part of that is because there's an ordinary, usual way of listening. That's what probably all of you have been doing while I'm talking, right? Sometimes you're paying attention. Sometimes you're distracted by something else. You may have passed judgment, right? You may have thought, oh, that makes some sense, or that doesn't make any sense. That is a normal and ordinary way of listening. It's how we listen most of the time, and it works fine for us. We also know that there's a curve on that. And for most people, it lasts about 45 minutes, right? Once you go beyond that 45 or 50-minute range, people start to tune out even more. That's ordinary listening, and it works fine. But there are times when we probably want to have a more focused listening, to truly listen to someone, particularly if we're engaged with someone who we know has experienced some difficulties, who's suffering. And we also know that no one is going to talk with us unless it's a safe environment, right? That they know that we are truly listening, that we are attending to what they're saying, and we are not passing judgment. And that's not as easy to do, Sometimes people think, oh, you people who were therapists, you did that for a living. You paid close attention. We weren't paying that much attention, right? First of all, you're there for healthcare, not to reveal your soul to us. And secondly, we had the same style of listening, but it was mediated by, we were listening with an effort of trying to help you with something. But it's hard to describe what that's like. I mean, we all know what it's like to have someone really truly listening to us, right? We've had that experience and it had great value. It doesn't happen very often and it doesn't need to happen very often, but it has great value. But how do we describe truly listening to someone? I thought about that, but I really couldn't come up with much. Kind of the cognitive constructs of paying attention, non-judgmental, all that doesn't mean a whole lot when we think about what is it really like. So I'll offer just a couple of ideas. One of them is that maybe truly listening to someone is the experience you have when maybe you're listening to some transformational music where you are absolutely engaged in that music. You're not passing judgment on it. You're not thinking about it. And time you kind of lose track of the sense of time. But when it's over, you realize that you really, truly were listening to that music. Probably doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen sometimes. Or maybe you have that same experience if you're watching a film or you're going to a play and it has such substantial felt life that you were totally absorbed in it and you were truly present and listening to that. But that's as close as I can come to describing it, because even though I think, oh, I really, really want to pay close attention, truly listen, if I think while that's happening that, oh, I need to be paying attention, everybody lost them, right? It's a different process, but of great value. One other part of communicating is speaking. That's the easier part, right? We all have had the experience of saying things we regret, things that have been hurtful to someone else, things we wish we hadn't said. And we've all experienced people saying hurtful things to us, things we wish they hadn't said. And we all, I'm sure, have the intention of not saying a hurtful thing to another person, right? We really don't want to do that. But there has to be a technique involved. You have to have a plan of action. So, and everyone probably has their own, but I'll just mention one that I found to be particularly helpful. It's something that I came across a long time ago when I was still working for a living, particularly as a family therapist. And families, as you can imagine, would come in high states of agitation, a lot of conflict, a lot of distress, a lot of misery. And as we understand, there's all kinds of dynamic issues underlying that, right? Historical trauma, loss, generations of very bad and abusive parenting, all kinds of things we can think of, temperament. But a family really cannot work on those issues. They can't mediate it or heal it in any way when they're in a state of significant conflict. If their habit is to argue and fight, they're going to argue and fight, even in the therapist's office. And so no change can take place. So there has to be some way to change that habit of conflict and fighting. And so this is one thing I use quite often. And it really comes from Sufism, from the Sufis, who we probably know. They're kind of that mystical sect of Islam. In the West, we know them really from what we call their romantic poetry, things written by people like Hafiz or Jalaluddin Rumi or Lala or Maghribi, very beautiful poetry. It's actually their teachings on the relationship between man and Allah. There are religious teachings, and they're written in that poetic verse, just like sutras are written, right? They're written in a poetic verse, and there's a reason for that. Most people then were illiterate. You wrote down a sutra, or if Rumi wrote a poem, no one could read it. Most people couldn't write it down, so it was a way to remember it. You'll see those, and we see those, right, little lines taken from various Sufi poets and all kinds of Buddhist and other religious teachings. So Anyway, but back to the point at hand. There is a practice among Sufis, specifically instructions on how you speak to someone else. And this is one I use with families a lot. I might have used different language, but in that practice, anything you want to say has to first pass through 3 gates. The first gate, or at the first gate, if you're going to say something, you're instructed to pause and think about whether the thing you want to say is the truth as you know it. That eliminates a certain number of things, right? But some things meet muster on that. And so if it does, you pass through the second gate. At the second gate, you're instructed to consider whether this truth as you know it is something that is necessary to say. That filters out a whole bunch of things as well. Some meet that muster. If it does, you go to the third gate, the final gate, and at the final gate, you have to consider whether that truth as you know it, which you have deemed to be necessary to say, can be said with love and kindness. And if so, speak, otherwise just be quiet. I think if you have a group of people with that practice of speaking, it's probably pretty quiet most of the time, right? But also that conversations are more meaningful. Or think of, for example, political debate. When the candidates followed that practice, totally different experience than we would have now. And so the question, do those things work? Well, with this particular technique, my observations in working with families is that if just one person in that family, whether it was a child or an adult, took up that practice, it had beneficial effects on everyone in the family, had some meaningful change. And I think in the same way, when we're having conversations with people, what we say affects everyone around us. And sometimes I think, well, we have to be very careful when we're talking to people who hold different political views than we have. And that's true. But the fact is, I almost never talk with people who have different political views. All of my friends think the same way I do, and so should I have to be careful? Yeah, because we can have conversations where we agitate our friends about these political things. And we've all had those conversations where everyone kind of gets in an uproar. Is there value in that? Probably not. So I've reached the end of the listening curve, but I've just got a few things about karma. As we know, karma really is our intentional action, right? Karma is behavior that we chose to do. It's not an accident. It's not an impulse. It is intentional behavior. And so I'm really talking about our actions towards others with the idea of behaving in a way that we're not causing suffering for someone else. We get into political issues that can be somewhat difficult. If you think of should we, these are not the concepts of politics, but how we treat people. Should we side with someone who's homeless against someone who lives in a mansion? Well, that's kind of tempting to do, I have to tell you, but it's not the middle way, right? We can do things to help people who are homeless. There's lots of things we can do. We can donate money to a shelter. We can donate goods to a homeless shelter. We can go work there. If you meet someone who's homeless on the street, you can, if the conditions are right, you can offer them a kind word or a few dollars. You can advocate with politicians or government people to have policies supporting homeless people or reducing the cost of housing. Should we side with people who live in poverty against people who have excessive wealth? Again, that's a little tempting, but it's not the middle way. And we can apply that to all kinds of people, right? Do we side with people who are oppressed versus people who are oppressing them? Again, tempting, but it's not the middle way. The middle way is to work to save all beings, right? To not cause suffering for anyone else. So that's what I have to say. We have a few minutes if anyone has a question or a comment.
Yes, could you repeat the three gates of speech that you mentioned from the Sufis?
Oh, sure, I might.
Hi.
There's three steps or three gates. At the first gate, you're instructed to pause and consider whether the thing that you intend to say is the truth as you know it. If it is the truth that as you know it, you can proceed to the second gate. And at the second gate, you have to consider whether the truth as you know it is something that is necessary to say. If it meets those two standards, you can proceed to the third gate, where you have to consider whether this truth as you know it, which you have deemed necessary to say, is something you can say with love and kindness. If it meets those three standards, those criteria, speak up. Otherwise, keep your silence.
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
It ends all speculation and discussions then.
I would think so, or at least most of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It changes our approach. If you want to say something and you consider, oh, is this the truth as I know it? You might say, oh, no, just my opinion, right? We can express our opinions, but we want to express our opinions as opinion, not as fact. You know, so makes life a little simpler.
How do you regard the precept of not committing false speech, which is not to say a single word?
Well, Mary, that's a complicated question.
And deliberately so.
It wouldn't be my understanding of that precept that we should be silent. I would think, again, it's my ideas about it. Think that it might reference a thoughtful speech and uttering no speech that implies that there is self and other. That only references wholesome thought.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I exactly follow how that relates to the precept.
Well, maybe.
How do you regard the precept of not committing false speech? Or maybe we shouldn't even go there. Maybe the gate of the second gate, which is the second gate, I'm sorry.
Necessary. to say.
Necessary to say, yes. It seems most applicable to that gate, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. So again, it kind of, when we talk in those terms, we have all of those kind of cognitive constructs around them. And the precepts are not instructions on how to behave. They are pointing the way to being aware of your true nature. And we have to assume, again, intellectually or cognitively, that being aware of the true nature mediates how we speak to others. You know?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think they are instructions for behavior, but they're not commandments. We have a choice. And I think you're right, though. I think what they do is point to how we become aware
Yes.
in across many different situations.
I agree.
What does awareness mean? How does it manifest in many different situations? It does provide guides to behavior, but they're not chisels in stone. They're not commandments.
Sure.
And if we don't do that, we haven't offended anyone, offended a supreme being or anything like that. But yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you.